Hi there.
What a bunch of deadbeats.
Yes, we are. Energetic time travelers.
Yeah.
We got that name, believe me.
Look at that one.
Smile.
Hey, what was that?
Hey, how come she carries...
That's what I thought.
The only smart one among us.
Sure, bud. Picture of it coming in.
Just gotta have the shirt on.
Whoopee.
I'm gonna get June into that dancing when we move to Tennessee.
Picture back, watch where I would hold my ice. I hold my ice cream. Oh
You hear me, Jerry?
Yeah.
I see the fin in the boats. There it goes. Look at that fin. Whoa. We're almost at the boat.
Have a rest. It's going to be right here. Look. I thought it was done wrong.
in this part of Ontario. In April, they captured Toronto, or York as it was known, burnt the fort, and retreated back to Niagara, Fort Niagara. In May 1813, they captured and destroyed Fort George in Niagara-on-the-Lake, and the American fleet controlled Lake Ontario for several months into 1813. At Burlington Bay, the British had a garrison, they had a depot of supplies, they had cannons, they had ammunition for the troops throughout the rest of Ontario, and it had to be guarded very carefully. But with ascendancy on Lake Ontario, the American fleet under Admiral Chauncey was able to sail into Burlington Bay and land a landing party to attack the British garrison, a very small garrison of about 60 or 70 militiamen stationed at the point, and overwhelm them in battle. What you're looking at in front of you is the British encampment. Soldiers at the time of the War of 1812 moved around a lot from place to place and stayed under canvas when they could get it. More often than not, the soldiers just rolled up in a blanket or a greatcoat and slept under the stars. Even in the winter, there are accounts of British troops sleeping out in the open, using a few cedar boughs for cover, covering themselves with an old blanket, and after a tiring march, sleeping until the time they were roused in the morning, which was usually about 3 or 4 in the morning. The life of a soldier along the frontier during the time of the War of 1812 was extremely harsh. All the British soldiers were volunteers, as were the militia, volunteers to fight for the duration of the war. The British soldier volunteered usually to serve a term up to 21 years of service. He got paid a penny or a shilling. Disease and sickness tore through the ranks of the soldiers. Hygiene as we know it was not practiced back then, and many a soldier succumbed to tuberculosis and various diseases caused by drinking too much. It was a very boring life for the soldier, and many of them tended to help them through the boring days and nights by over-drinking. These are very small guns, though. They do a lot of damage at short range, but at any distance they wouldn't do much damage to American ships or boats. Now notice the artillerymen preparing the cannon for firing. Cannons were very tricky at their best. They had to be wormed with a type of corkscrew instrument to bring out any debris that was left in the barrel. Sponged with a sponge that was dipped in water to swab out the bore to make sure there were no burning embers left inside. If there were burning embers left inside the gun, and you ram down a second charge, the second charge would be ignited and the gunner would actually lose his arm in the explosion, with the premature explosion. Our artillerymen today, who are from the Royal Navy, or perhaps from the Provincial Marine, are being very careful with the loading of their piece of artillery.
That guy in red over there, dressed up.
These guns could be loaded and fired by an experienced crew, historically, about twice a minute. But firing that quickly is not the safest thing in the world, so our gunners will be going a little more carefully today. Took about 30 seconds for a very well-trained crew, about 2 minutes for a not very well-trained crew to load and fire this weapon. And each time they loaded it, it was good for just one shot. It had to be reloaded again for the second shot. The Americans were well known for sneaking behind British positions in their hydrofoils. Although these are small guns for the lakeshore watching out for any possible American movement, are some soldiers of the 71st Highland Light Infantry Regiment, a regular British Army regiment. You'll notice that their bonnets have red and white dicing along the bottom that indicates that it's a Highland regiment. Even though they were Highland Light Infantry, they were not on campaign dressed in kilts as you might expect them to be. They were dressed as regular British soldiers with the exception of their shako, which was a particular Scottish design. The most common weapon used at the time was a smoothbore musket. It could be loaded and fired by an experienced soldier about 4 times a minute. By American soldiers, it was fired about 2 times a minute. They were less well trained than the British or the Canadians at the time. One of the muskets in the arms of or in the hands of a marksman could hit a man at about 70 yards. They were not very accurate, slow to load. They often misfired in humid weather, in rain. If it was too windy or too cold, the weapon would misfire. Similarly, when the weapon got very dirty, it would misfire as well at the time. So the whole idea of the red coat was that a mile away, 1,000 men would look like 2,000 men. So you may be standing there in your untrained group as they're coming towards you with their flags flapping in the wind and their fifes and drums beating. You can see them a mile away. 1,000 men are going to look like 2,000 men. You may say, look at those lobster backs in their red coats. You can see them a mile away. There sure are a lot of them. As they get closer, if they're half a mile away, because the red coats stand out so much, the men are going to actually look bigger than they are. They're going to be very intimidating indeed as they march in very careful formation. You still can't fire at them. You've got to wait until they're about 100 yards away before you can fire at them. But they're going. Smoke started to clear. You could see that they'd reloaded their muskets and were getting ready to advance on you again. It was a very frightening prospect. More battles were won by the British Army by frightening the enemy into running away than by actually killing, wounding, or otherwise engaging the enemy. But on the day that the King's Inn Tavern was captured, there were about 300 Americans and about 60 militia. The militia were very well trained, but 60 muskets firing all together is no match against 300.
Yes, I am.
Okay, they're about to fire their piece of artillery. The gun's loaded. gunner is waving his linstock in the air to get the piece of rope that's on the linstock glowing hot. It's that's used to set off the piece of artillery. The gun is loaded with black powder, be loaded with a solid iron cannonball or a grape shot, small iron balls quilted together and covered with a canvas bag. It's getting ready to fire. The gun is primed and loaded. Now the gunner hasn't allowed for windage, and I saw that shot land just about 5 feet over to the port side of that American boat out in the water. Ready for another shot. Slightly smaller gun. It looks like a 1.5 pounder.
Just give me that one you've got under. Let's do one more early, folks. Oh, you know I'm dreaming of high. I'll sit all alone. If you can't come around, and at least play this telephone. disguise? Okay, we're gonna start off nice and slow for you right now.